his own words, it is his worst-selling novel, and I think there's also some implication that it's also just one of his worst-written novels. He's just brattish and self-obsessed. If you're nosediving into a state of reading apathy, if you are on the skids, your reading motivation is in the dirt, if you're desperately needing a boost of reinvigoration, then don't go to these. You should approach these books only when you are buoyed on that effervescent supercharge of inspiration and epiphany through reading great works, and you think, you know what, I can handle gulping, a liter of putrid porridge, or when you can inhale a stale cloud of belly lint, or when you think you can handle spreading a smearing of literary toe jam across your prancing prandial poetry. I think you get the drift. These books, in my opinion, are complete duds by classic authors who have written masterpieces. Of course, it's subjective, so let me know which books massively let you down by authors with a gigantic reputation. I tried to be fair in compiling this list, and by being fair, I mean I tried to exclude overzealous juvenilia on the one hand, and final decrepit mutterings on the other. Philip Roth, The Breast. Now, Philip Roth is not a fashionable author these days, but I think that he is masterful in his prose writing and very comic at times. Some of his novels are sublime, but The Breast is just not. I mean, it says it all in the title. I suppose we could see this as some kind of play on or echo of Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Instead of waking up as a bug or a rodent, this guy wakes up as a breast, a full human-sized mammary gland. It is literally and figuratively masturbatory, and it's just a waste of time, really. It feels like Roth is just basically having us on. Are you gullible enough to sit down and read 100 pages of a human-sized breast going through the kind of fraught existential crisis of being that breast and all the kind of repressed mommy issues and psychoanalytical hijinks that he employs? I mean, it's just, it's not a serious book. I've got Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's complete illustrated novels in this old, grungy Chancellor Press edition. Don't freak out. I'm not going to lambaste this entire book, because The Hound of the Baskervilles is the best of these, hands down, in my opinion. It's spectral and spooky and deliciously eerie, but The Sign of Four is by far the most disappointing of these. I found it to be extraordinarily dated. It's quite offensive in its cultural stereotypes, really far-fetched and tedious, considering it's only, 150 odd pages long. The retrospective device that Arthur Conan Doyle tends to use quite frequently, especially in the novels, is just such a backward reeling that I think completely bogs down the forward momentum of this text. And yeah, it's a story of revenge, but I just found it really quite laborious. Next, I've got Toni Morrison and Mercy. I actually martyred myself by reading this book cover to cover twice, because I used it for research in my bachelor's thesis of my English degree, and safe to say that having gone through it twice, it's very tepid both times through. I think what is a pity about A Mercy, especially again in comparison to Beloved, Home, Jazz, The Bluest Eye, and Song of Solomon, is that it's a slim novel, but it doesn't really have cohesion, in my opinion. It feels a bit dissolute. It's a historical novel set in the 17th century in the kind of Wild West of America, about an Anglo-Dutch trader and his household, made up of characters from very different backgrounds. And I think the characters just don't seem plausible. They are quite, without really giving too much away, although I'm not recommending this book, so maybe some of you wouldn't be perturbed if I did give the plot away, but I won't do it. But it's just like there are inconsistencies in the actions, the behavior of the characters. And yes, people can be capricious and unpredictable, of course, but there needs to be some sense of coherence in a fictional character, or at least justifications for disjunctures in behavior and action. So I don't think that it's psychologically strong enough to sustain those changes and those inconsistencies of character. It's quite a forgettable, disappointing book by Morrison's high standards. And then I've got Clarice Lispector. I've got the complete stories here. Now, this is about 7 or 8 story collections in this book by the Brazilian 20th century modernist Clarice Lispector. It's quite an uneven collection. Covert Joy is an absolutely sublime, mesmerizing collection of stories. There is not one false note across those 10 or 12 stories. So, one comes to her with an expectation of supreme prose mastery. This collection does include her very early stuff, which I'm not going to comment on, and her very late stuff, which again, we're going to leave out of this discussion. But the Via Crucis of the Body is a later story collection. It came after Covert Joy. And it feels a bit doodly. It feels a bit kind of off the cuff and unpolished and nebulous at times, almost like diary jottings of a bored housewife. Now, bored housewives are one of the kind of key figures that Lispector employs, and often to good effect, but sometimes you need to have some kind of recognition or sympathy with a character. A character can be very unlikable, but somehow you need to feel some kind of connection, right? Even if you think this character is unconscionable in their behavior, but yet I recognize their humanity somehow. But in some of these stories in the Via Crucis of the Body, they're just overly precious, pretentious, stifled by ennui, and quite cruel and dismissive, and it just doesn't have the sustaining impetus to make it feel more than just sketches. So very disappointing by an otherwise exceptional author. Next, I've got Haruki Murakami, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. Now, this is again quite a divisive writer, Haruki Murakami. Some people hate him, some people love him. I haven't read all of his books, but some of his novels are really serenely beautiful, such as Norwegian Wood, and another lesser-known novel of his, which is South of the Border, West of the Sun. It's a slim, spare, ruminative, delicate book, interlaced with yearning in a very gorgeous way. And I had this book on my shelf since 2022, and I read it, I think, last year. So I had it on the shelf for a while. And I was really looking forward to it because it's a memoir. Murakami loves running, and I just figured that whatever he puts his hand to in terms of writing projects, that it would have that subtle loveliness. But I found this to be banal, shallow, a sense of being a sketch, and maybe even in that sense we can say a sketchiness to it. It doesn't hold together. It feels like he's trying to bring writing and running together, and I thought that there was a lot of potential there in terms of analogy and metaphor. It just felt almost like a logbook, a writing logbook, with some sprinklings of literary reflections. Very, very disappointing, flat, uninspiring book. Next, I've got Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest, and other plays. Now, I love Wilde. Most of what he's written is superlative. I can't say that is the case with Salome. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of his poetry because I think a lot of it he wrote when he was quite young, and it's a real trudge. We've got here, the major plays. It's actually not all of the plays, and again, I'm giving him a pass on plays like The Duchess of Padua, which is definitely him finding his voice, but it's quite forgettable as well. But Salome, I just think it's so feverish in an unappealing way. It's so sort of ornate in its biblical allusions and its sensuousness. It feels over-rich. It feels like he over-egged the pudding. It feels indulgent, steamy to the point of fogging up my desire to actually, ever reread this. I probably will reread it at some point, but I found it to be really disappointing and, overly purple in its floweriness. Next, I've got Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Now, this might raise a few people's hackles because I know that this is actually some people's favorite Joseph Conrad book, but what is wrong with you? Please take a long, hard look at yourself in the mirror if that's the case. Now, of course, Conrad is again a very unfashionable writer in today's times because he was an unsavory, or some of his views were quite unsavory, and I'm certainly not going to justify him on that. But we're not here for a moralizing competition. We're here for great works of literature, and they were all written by flawed individuals. So let's just get that out the way. The Secret Agent, The End of the Tether is a lesser-known book of his that I love. Heart of Darkness, in all of its troubled doubleness and spookiness, and it's obviously flawed in many ways, but it is an astounding and idiosyncratic work of literature. I'm not going to talk about Almayer's Folly, which I think is a steaming pile of folly, but it's his first novel, so we're going to leave that out. But Lord Jim is, it's canonical in many people's eyes. It's, like I said, many people's favorite books, and I've actually got this beautiful early edition in the Penguin 3000. The character himself, Jim, is just so precious and misunderstood and gloomy and moody, but all of those traits of his, he's just brattish and self-obsessed. So the narrator is actually Marlowe, same character as the narrator of Heart of Darkness. And Marlowe, the book functions because Marlowe is like so fascinated by Jim, but I just don't find Jim fascinating. I just find him really, really irritating, and so that's just a bad combination. And then throw in all of the antiquated prejudices that Conrad at times interrogates in some of his work, but in this book it doesn't feel that there's much reflection. Jim is just a bonehead with a big ego, and I don't really have time for it. All right, we're going to do two more here to wrap up. I've got Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Don't freak out. I promise I'm not going to talk about A Christmas Carol. This volume includes The Haunted Man and The Chimes. Now, I absolutely love A Christmas Carol, of course, and I love The Chimes. I've talked about The Chimes on this channel before as well. But The Haunted Man is the third of those three Christmas novellas. I think there are 5 in total, or 6 in total, that Dickens wrote. And The Haunted Man doesn't come off for me because it is overly sweet, it is sentimental, heading rapidly south towards maudlin, and it's very moralistic. It's like a Christmas pudding with like 473 times more raisins than it should have, and perhaps 4 bottles of brandy instead of 4 teaspoons of brandy or whatever. It's just disappointing, and I love Dickens. So obviously when you have an author with such astoundingly high standards, then yeah, it's they're gonna let the team down from time to time. Then I've got Graham Greene. I've got this big fat book club Associates of London edition. We've talked about this one on the channel before as well. I am a proud resident of Greenland, but from time to time he wrote some real duds, and I'm going to talk about It's a Battlefield. So imagine Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, so this kind of condensed time frame based in London with the city of London itself as a key character, that imbues the whole story with life and energy and vividness, but except to strip out all of the color, all of the vivacity, all of the joy, all of the pleasure, and you're left with a kind of bone dry, grey and grizzled London of shuttered shop windows and rustling newspaper, tumbling down the street, and bleary-eyed, bleak and bitter characters that just can't stand life and don't trust one another, and it's extraordinarily lacking in hope and in warmth. And I think Greene kind of regretted that. In his own words, it is his worst selling novel, and I think there's also some implication that it's also just one of his worst written novels. He actually suppressed the republication of his very, very early work, so it's quite hard to get hold of his very early attempts at novel writing. So, we're going to let him get away with those. And I also have some of his like late reflections, kind of memoir-ish books, like A Sort of Life, that I found to be quite lacking in vigor, but we're going to forgive him those as well. But It's a Battlefield is like, it sounds combative. It sounds, that there's some kind of force and resolute friction that we're going to encounter in this novel, but it's just dusty and grimy and cold and windswept, and it doesn't really repay much in terms of readerly satisfaction. We're going to leave it there. Let me know which books by classic authors. Let me know which books by classic authors left you cold and high and dry and disappointed. We'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you for watching.